Hey guys, this is Bert from Season Gaming, and I just wanted to do a quick controller overview with the release of the Nintendo Switch. We just got the Switch, and as you know, it does come with this controller, as previously known as the dog ears, because you stick both of the left and the right controller inside of here, the Joy-Cons. After playing with about, I'd say 20-30 hours of the Switch so far, I have to say it's not my favorite controller and kind of puzzling as to who they're trying to target. If you're an adult, you might have some issues with the top triggers of this controller. It's really small, and they're really close to each other. So if you have bigger fingers, you find yourself constantly rubbing next to each other on these triggers. So I wouldn't say the best controller, however, not the worst. I have seen some other controllers that are pretty poor. So what I wanted to do is, number one, we did an unboxing earlier on the Nintendo Switch Pro controller, and it's one of my favorite controllers of recent memory. I'll explain why, but before that, I wanted to kind of show a little bit of history of kind of where we've come in controllers in the last 20 years. And even, well, not quite 20 years, but the last 15, 20 years to say the least. In the front, we have all of our wired controllers from a generation not too far ago, but you have your GameCube controller right here. One of the best controllers of this generation, I would say. If you're coming off the Sony bandwagon, where you love everything Sony, you have your DualShock 2. They haven't really changed controllers since the end of the PlayStation 1 generation, where they brought the two thumbsticks in. And my biggest issue with a lot of Sony controllers is that thumbsticks are really close to each other. If you can kind of see here, my thumbs are already touching, so if you're going back and forth here, you would hit each other all the time. A lot of people didn't have a problem with it. This one was actually great for fighting games, and I actually preferred the PlayStation 2 controller, the DualShock 2, over the Xbox controller for fighting games. But for almost everything else, I actually preferred the Xbox Controller S. Now, one of the things that lacked in the Controller S is it didn't have two sets of triggers on the very top. The PlayStation 2 controller did. So depending on games, it really depended on where you wanted to go with games at that time and what you preferred. A lot of people love the Gran Turismo series. It's really hard to not play Gran Turismo when you're not playing these. Now, the Controller S, something to keep in mind, this was not the original Xbox controller. It initially launched with what was called the Duke. That was the big, massive controller back in 2001. And in 2002, by popular demand, this one came out. This one's a lot smaller, fit a lot better in the hand, and it worked really well with controls. Now, definitely not the best controller ever. A lot of people actually didn't like it as much. Not a problem. What happened in the next generation was actually an improvement for Microsoft, and what actually led to 360 for most of the generation in the console wars of Sony and Microsoft. The Xbox 360 controller, one of the best controllers ever, especially during the time. Huge advancement over the Xbox original controller, which is the Xbox Controller S. Now, the Xbox 360 controller didn't get an S variant, I guess you would call it. They changed a lot of colors, they improved the buttons a little bit, they added some texture on some of the joysticks, but nothing ever massive, as did happen with the Controller S and later in the Xbox One controllers, which we'll talk about in a second. But if you remember, the DualShock 3 came out. You can almost not tell them apart. If I was to show them to you from a distance and you were looking at them, you can barely tell any difference. As we do remember, these one did have, the 6-axis did have a little bit of ability. You could mess around with your controller on some games. Not every game took advantage of the 6-axis, but it was a pretty good controller. And it also did start the world with the Sony world with the wireless controllers. And it did kind of bring into the new issue of including the battery inside the controller. Now, this is kind of a huge debate among gamers. Some people love that Sony does that. Others don't. What happens if your battery goes bad? You can't really change it out unless you take the controller apart. Sometimes Sony will send you a battery or you buy a third party to kind of improve that. But one of the biggest issues I've always had with Sony controllers is their battery life is kind of lame. We'll talk about that with the PS4 controller in a second, which I have huge issues with when it comes to battery life. Now, while we're on the topic of Nintendo, I've included kind of the controllers of that generation. So the Nintendo Wii's competition during the time was the 360 and the PS3. You came out with this controller, which I still consider one of the lamest controllers of all time. It was really hard to develop with as far as making good games. You can't really think of third-party titles that really use too much advantage of the Wii controller, with the exception of a few. But unless you're a Nintendo person, you really only played first-party games with the Wii. That started with the Nintendo GameCube. We talked about that in some console comparisons as to why that happened, but Nintendo has really turned into a first-party machine where you really buy the first-party titles, and you really only buy a few of the third-party titles. So I have a huge issue with this controller. Thankfully, Nintendo released their smaller controller, which was supposed to be advertised for the Virtua console. So if I move this to the camera a little bit, you'll notice the buttons a little bit more. This was pretty good. They did echo the control of the Sony issue, where the thumbsticks are too close to each other when you look at them right here. However, they were further apart than the Sony PlayStation 1, 2, and 3, and it worked a lot better. You also had 2 sets of triggers on the top where you could kind of mess with your buttons. I actually enjoy this controller quite a bit. It was technically wireless in the sense that it didn't connect to your console. These would connect to the bottom of the Wiimote, and you could actually have wireless capability from the console. Your battery life was based on what was in your Wiimote. So wireless kind of, but not all the way. Kind of a positive and negative, but I did really enjoy this controller. Now, where are we today? So the Wii U kind of released in a weird time. The Wii U / the Wii were both competitors to the PS3 and the 360. However, the Wii kind of came out. A lot of people joke that the Wii had the same power of the GameCube, just with motion controls, but maybe a little bit more power. And then came the Wii U, a lot more powerful than the Wii, but still not anywhere near the 360 and PS3 when it came to the end of the generation, and you really saw that with titles. Now, the Wii U's been the sole competitor from Nintendo until the Switch has come out when you compete against the Xbox One and the PS4. So what is the Wii U as far as controllers go? Well, you have this massive gamepad, as they called it back in the day, and it worked really well for a lot of games. However, it did have a cheaper feel to it. It's pretty light. The battery life is, it's okay. It's nothing too special out of the box. But a lot of games you could play without the TV. However, there was a lot of other titles that came later in the generation where you had to use the gamepad and the TV at the same time, and they kind of worked in conjunction with each other. So the beginning, Nintendo did advertise this as an alternative to having to use your TV. There was commercials of families trying to watch a TV show while maybe their son or daughter wanted to play games. So they took this gamepad away. The funny thing is you couldn't get too far from the Wii U console and play it, and then the battery life was And later in the generation, games, obviously, as I mentioned a second ago, couldn't be played only on the gamepad. Thankfully, later in the generation, not off the bat, they launched this Wii U Pro Controller. One of the best controllers that I've ever played with, mainly because the battery life is insane on this thing. You can play somewhere between 30 to 40 hours on one charge, and it was great. Now, one thing that was weird is your joysticks are at the very top together. They're not offset. So different from Microsoft, to where the joysticks are offset, and different from Sony, where they're right next to each other towards the bottom of the controller. It did have a good feel, however, it's kind of light, which is kind of strange because with the built-in battery in the back of this, you would think that it'd weigh a little bit more. However, I still love this controller. For any advanced games that you want to play on the Wii U, this controller is the way to go. They are getting harder to find with the Wii U no longer being produced from Nintendo, so kind of an interesting take. Which kind of segues us into where is Nintendo now and what are they doing? So you have the Switch, and with the Switch you have your standard controller that we introduced this video with, and then you have the Pro Controller, which is launching with the console on launch date. So how does this feel? What is good about it? What's not? First of all, let me mention, when you're docked on the console, and if you're not playing with this, you're missing out. This is the way to go when you're playing docked in the console. Obviously, when you're not docked into the console of the Switch, you're using the proprietary controllers that come with it, the Joy-Cons. However, with this is one of the best feeling controllers I've ever played with. Now, I would put this somewhere, as far as feel, somewhere in the mix of a Xbox 360 controller and probably the Xbox One controller. Now, it does feel really great in the hands. One thing that's always been kind of funny to me is if you're an Xbox controller and you're coming into Nintendo, the front buttons here are flipped. So your Y and B and your X and A's are in the opposite areas of where they would be on the Xbox controller. So as you're playing through games, you might have a button prompt. It'll actually show the opposite, and you'll find yourself struggling until you adjust to whatever game you're playing. Amazing thing about this, it's about 40 hours on one charge. Can you imagine playing a week of gaming never having to charge your controller ever? So great for that. The joysticks have a little click when you move them, and it feels fantastic. And the top triggers and the bumpers feel really good. Which takes us to the end of this little area as far as controllers and where we are today. The Elite, which has kind of been known as the best controller for gaming right now, it includes PC gaming if you're intending on using a controller and not keyboard and mouse. Obviously really hard to compare when you compare price. Xbox One controllers came out at $150. I've seen them as low as $125 regularly on eBay brand new. If you find them used, you can buy them under $100. However, I don't recommend buying used controllers unless you know who they're coming from or if you know they're pretty much brand new. Other than that, not really worth buying a used controller. The PS4, I just wanted to mention this one really quick because it is the most common used controller in console gaming today, and some people love this thing. I have a few issues with it. First of all, I want to mention it's a huge improvement from the PS2 and the PS3. However, the battery life in this thing is a joke. On a full charge, you're getting somewhere between 3 and 4 hours, and that's really bothersome because you're constantly having to connect. I mean, why? You also have the argument of the built-in battery. I know people complain, oh, Xbox still uses built-in batteries. Well, you can recharge these things and switch them in and out without any problems, as well as the plug-and-play kit, which is kind of obvious. Whatever, if you want to complain about that, you can. PS4, they did change around the joystick, so this is kind of a huge improvement, and I think it feels great. This is the newer PlayStation 4 controller. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the newer Slim consoles and the Pro controller, and the Pro console do come with this newer controller. The light bar is at the top. The buttons have a slightly different texture, and the newer buttons are lighter gray versus the black color. This also has more of a matte feeling to it when you look at the rear surroundings of the controller. Now back to the Switch Pro controller. It's a little more pricey than your standard controllers that exist today. A standard Xbox controller, you can see them on sale all the time for $45 to $50. Your PS4 controller, same thing. Oddly enough, the Switch controller is near $80. So is it worth it? Yeah, for gaming on the Switch it is. However, if you're at the beginning of the Switch library, there's not really many games you can use the Pro controller for, with the exception of Zelda, which is a great game. And you can really take advantage of it there. But the other launch titles, you don't really need it yet. So are you going to be using a Pro controller? I'm not sure. The Pro controller also comes with a 5-foot charging cable. Works really well. And at the same time, you're not going to be using it that much. Once again, 40 hours of game time on your controller. So where are we with the Switch? Again, just to briefly summarize it, standard controller, not bad, however, not the best. With the current library, you're fine with this. Zelda took a little time to get used to with this controller. If you're only playing Zelda and you have the extra cash to spend, buy the Pro controller. It's fantastic. You'll have a hard time going back to other controllers and not realizing that Nintendo has a quality product here. Thanks for joining us on Seasoned Gaming, and we'll see you next time.